Good morning. This is Colin Calloway. At least it's morning here in Vermont right now. I'm Professor of History, Professor of Native American Studies, and I teach a class called The Invasion of America. It should actually be Invasions, plural, because what we look at in that class is not only the arrival of European and African peoples to America, but also the importation of new animals, new plants, new crops, insects, ideas, religions, and of course, diseases. And with particular emphasis on the many crowd-killing epidemic diseases that were common in Europe and Asia and Africa at the time. Smallpox, cholera, measles, various forms of plague, bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, etc., all of which were unknown in the Americas and therefore had massive impacts on indigenous populations, to the extent that they changed the shape of the world. Prior to 1492, it's estimated a fifth of the world's population lived in the American hemisphere. In the wake of European invasion, that population balance, if you like, in the world shifted dramatically. Indigenous populations in the Americas plummeted. European populations escalated, in part because of the new foodstuffs brought to Europe from the Americas. And much of the increase in European population was absorbed by the Americas with mass immigration to the Americas. Right? And a major factor, if not the major factor, in determining that massive shift in the world was the introduction of epidemic diseases. It used to be that we talked about this in terms of the impact of diseases like smallpox on populations that had no immunity to them, that had no prior exposure. The term that was used was a virgin soil epidemic, because a disease like smallpox hitting a population that had had no prior exposure could inflict a death toll of 90%, and often did. We now better understand that the devastation of these old world diseases in the Americas was compounded by the context in which those diseases occurred. And that was a context of colonialism, which unleashed its own disruptions on American Indian society, upending traditional economic practices, generating increased war, generating slave raiding and slave trading between Indian communities, new levels of violence, new levels of uncertainty, all the kind of factors that help to make indigenous populations more vulnerable to epidemic diseases, and then hampered their recovery after epidemic diseases, rendering them more vulnerable again to the next epidemic disease that came down the pike. So whereas in Europe, population might recover after an epidemic disease, in the Americas, populations had much less chance to recover. I'm going to focus on smallpox as the most deadly, perhaps the best known, and one of the most enduring scourges of humanity. The World Health Organization estimated at one point that more people in human history had died of smallpox than any other single factor. And it's something that plagued Europe. Elizabeth I had smallpox. It's one of the reasons why she died the Virgin Queen. William and Mary of William and Mary College. William had smallpox. I believe his wife died of it. His parents died of it. George Washington had smallpox as a young man, and having survived it, he was then immune for life. So smallpox in Europe, very often by the 18th century, was more of a childhood disease because so many people got it. But once you had it, then you were immune to life, for life. Imported to the Americas, it was devastating for native populations from the 16th century to the 20th century. The coincidence of an outbreak of smallpox turned the tables or affected the outcome of Cortez's invasion of Mexico, or Pizarro's invasion of Peru, toppling these empires and making possible Spanish conquest. When the Pilgrims arrived in New England in Massachusetts Bay in the early 17th century, they talked about walking into fields and picking up the tools, the implements that people had been using to cultivate those fields. Right? The people were gone. They hadn't died of smallpox, but they had died of some unknown epidemic. It's thought it might have been some form of plague that swept the coast of New England from 1616 to 1619. Right? The people were gone. The Puritans put this down to God sweeping aside the heathen to make way for his chosen people. But the repercussions that it had are significant because they illustrate how these diseases played out across the continent. The Wampanoag peoples, or the surviving Wampanoag people on the coast of Massachusetts, befriended the Pilgrims. One of the reasons they did that was because newly weakened in the wake of this smallpox, of this epidemic, they needed allies against more powerful indigenous neighbors further inland who had not been hit so hard. So diseases like this not only took a tremendous death toll, but they also tore at the social fabric of native societies, and they also had repercussions in war, diplomacy, political arrangements, etc. And we'll look at some of those. The readings that I've suggested for you are both by a scholar named Elizabeth Fenn, and up until a few years ago, Liz and I were the only people that I knew of who'd written about, researched and written about a smallpox epidemic that hit the American West about the time of the American Revolution. And we're going to focus on that. One of the articles that Elizabeth Fenn wrote is about biological warfare in the 18th century, which was, of course, a very precarious thing to mess with, right? Because you were unleashing a genie out of the bottle. But it focuses on a famous smallpox event, which is one of the few, perhaps the only, case which is actually documented when the British used smallpox as germ warfare against Indian people. General Geoffrey Amherst, who was the British commander-in-chief in North America in 1763, at a time when the British were engaged in war with a coalition of Indian tribes in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, wrote to one of his subordinate commanders saying, "Couldn't we infect these savages with smallpox?" And at Fort Pitt in 1763, visiting Indian emissaries who'd come to the fort to suggest they surrender because the Indians were besieging the fort, were given blankets and handkerchiefs taken from the hospital at the fort where there was smallpox. And shortly after that, smallpox broke out among the Indians. This has been a controversial issue, and it's caused controversy in, as you might expect, Amherst, Massachusetts, which is named after the general, and at Amherst College. How can we have a college and an inn named after somebody who did this? Right? Now, there's no question that Amherst wanted this to happen. There's no question that it did happen, because we've seen the expense account, if you like, that the people at the fort, the traders and officers at the fort, submitted to the British government, asking for reimbursement for the blankets that were given to the Indians. Right? But the timing is a little off. The giving of the blankets happened before Amherst expressed the desire for this to happen. Doesn't let him off the hook, but it does reveal that this is something that people were thinking about as a last resort. But it had to be a last resort because people feared this disease. During the American Revolution, Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John, who's off at the Continental Congress, because smallpox is on the move. And she says, what do I do about the children? Because the only known preventative of smallpox at the time was variolation or inoculation, by which you took smallpox, smallpox matter, right, and rubbed it on a patient in on an open wound or something, hoping that they would get a mild case of smallpox, survive, and then be immune for life. That's a horrendous prospect for a choice for a parent to have to make. It's a little bit like Russian roulette. Right? So people were not going to engage in this lightly. And smallpox was devastating and terrifying for non-native populations as well as native. For native people, we know that in this area of the world, the northeastern United States and Canada, there was a massive smallpox epidemic in 1633, 1634. In the southeastern United States, what is now the United States, huge smallpox pandemic all across the South in 1696. That probably started when slave ships docked in Virginia with smallpox on board. And from there, it spread all the way across the interior of the American South. Why? Because by that time, slavery, slave trading, and slave raiding was already fully entrenched in the American South. But the slaves who were being captured and traded and transported were not African slaves yet. They were Indian slaves. This was part of the demands of colonialism for labor. Charleston, South Carolina, was a port not only for introducing African slaves as it became, but a port for exporting Indian slaves to the Caribbean. And Indian people were raiding other Indian people to take captives from as far away as western Mississippi, transport them to Charleston, where they would trade them for guns, steel weapons, and other things they needed, and then turn around and go take more Indian slaves. Right? And this was all wrapped up in the deerskin trade as well. What it meant was that when smallpox arrived in 1696, there were these highways of contact and contagion already in place so that it spread across enormous areas of the American South. Smallpox was a recurrent visitor through the 17th century, through the 18th century. And I want to focus on one epidemic. Let me just get to this. Just take me a moment here. Show you some maps primarily. So take a look at this. first of all, to kind of reorient our thinking a little bit. Look at this map of North America. First of all, the thing that strikes us is how huge North America is, because we're used to thinking that most of us seeing it as the United States. And actually, historians often explain the history of the United States as if that history could always be explained by what happened between two borders, the border with Canada and the border with Mexico, which, of course, borders did not exist for most of American history. Just look at how enormous Canada is, right? North of the Great Lakes, thinking of the Great Lakes as kind of the center of North America rather than the northern tip or the northern edge of North America. But when we see a map of this country, whether it's a weather map or a map of red and blue states or whatever, we see it with state borders and often see it with highways. So rid that from our vision and look at a map like this. And you'll see that contrary to American history, which often depicts developments as happening from east to west, right? American history is all about westward movement. Developments happened more often north-south because the great mountain chains, the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, run roughly north and south. The enormous river systems in the country create a huge Y in which the Ohio River and then the Missouri, Yellowstone rivers empty into the Mississippi that kind of dissects the continent. Again, running north to south. And important developments that had major impacts on the people of this continent happen not moving from east to west, but from south to north. The introduction of corn out of Mexico and spreading across huge areas of North America transformed the way of life of thousands of native peoples. The introduction of horses comes out of Mexico. We'll look at that. And the introduction of this particular smallpox epidemic comes out of Mexico and then travels south to north. Stereotypical image that we have of Indian people, of course, is horse riding, buffalo hunting people. It's an image that is accurate really only for the Great Plains and peripheral areas in the West, and only for a period of time of roughly the 18th to the late 19th century. The evolution of Plains Indian society and those aspects of it is a function of the European invasion of America and the Spanish introduction of horses into North America, which transforms people's way of life. Because the Great Plains is an enormous grassland and has huge potential. Right? It supported buffalo herds of millions, right? Estimates at its height, 40, 50, 60 million buffalo, who knows. But Indian people, prior to the arrival of horses, tended to exist on the peripheries of the plains, to venture into the interior of the plains tentatively, and to harvest the buffalo herds precariously. Once horses are introduced, that transforms the ability of Plains Indian people to hunt buffalo. They can now follow the herds. And it creates unprecedented opportunities and possibilities for prosperity and power, so that Indian people actually move on to the plains in the early 18th century to take advantage of those new opportunities. They go west to seek these opportunities. And that creates a situation of tremendous movement. This is not a terrific map, but it shows the northward movement of horses. By the time of the Pueblo Revolt, 1680, in New Mexico, places like Santa Fe have become important centers for horses. And after the Pueblo revolt and when the Spaniards had driven out of New Mexico for a dozen years, that frees Indian people to get access to horses without restraint. Spaniards had tried to keep horses out of the hands of Indian people. And so horses then spread north and east and northeast through the plains into the Rockies, way up into Canada, where Indian people are trading and raiding for horses because you had to have horses to take advantage of the new way of life on the plains and the new opportunities on the plains. But also, it's an arms race. Horses were not only a way to get about, a source of mobility, they were a reason to go to war and a way for going to war. And if you didn't have horses and your neighbors had horses, you were in trouble. Right? So if you look here at where the Utes are, right? If you people did not have horses, they were likely to fall prey to neighbors to the south who would raid them to take their people captive, to trade to Spaniards who wanted Indian labor for their silver mines in Mexico. So the violence and the tentacles of colonialism project themselves through Indian country, with indigenous peoples visiting violence on Indian peoples to meet the demands of colonialism or to divert the tentacles of colonialism away from their own communities and families onto other people. And horses between 1680 and say 1730 spread all the way across Western North America up onto the Western plains of Canada. And you can see how they form these kind of highways of movement. You also look, if you look to the north, there's little symbols of guns. Right? Because roughly about the same time as horses are moving south to north, guns introduced by French and then French, Canadian, and British traders, primarily in Canada, but also further down the Mississippi, are being traded onto the plains and then from tribe to tribe in much the same way, but in reverse, and for much the same reasons. Right? You needed horses to take advantage and to survive. You needed guns to take advantage and survive. So the Great Plains by the 18th century is a place where there are these two frontiers kind of advancing toward each other and then passing and overlapping. Horse frontier from the south, gun frontier from the north. Wherever you are, you need to get both of those things, and your chances of survival increase if you can have both. Right? So people are moving and jostling for position to make sure that they have access to horses and to guns, and that they are therefore in charge of their own destiny, if you like, and not somebody else's victims. Here's maybe an easier to see map of how horses spread across the West, with those yellow dots indicating indigenous trade centers that became major sites for people to come and acquire horses. Right? So the Shoshone Rendezvous in Western Wyoming became a place where Crow Indian people, Flathead Indian people came for horses, which had been brought there by Ute and sometimes even Comanche people from the south. And then the horses spread from the Flathead and the Crow to the Blackfeet, etc. And those patterns of diffusion of horses have major repercussions, amplifying and intensifying existing trade networks in Plains Indian society. So look at this map, which highlights the Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara in this green area, which is roughly the Great Plains. Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arika are in block capitals, not because they are more important or larger native nations than others, but because of their significance in this instance. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arika villages on the upper Big Bend of the upper Missouri River were essentially farming tribes. And unlike some of the people on the plains who moved there in the 18th century to take advantage of the new equestrian buffalo way of life, Hidatsas, Mandans, and other people living on the Missouri River, Pawnees, Otos, Omaha, Missouri, been there a long time. And they hunted buffalo, but they were primarily sedentary farming tribes. They lived in settled villages, and they were able to do that because of their economic stability that rested on agriculture. Enormous fields of corn supplemented by beans, squash, other vegetables, planted, harvested, and cultivated by native women. Because they're at the northern edge of the corn growing season, that makes these villages a focal point. Hunting tribes from Canadian forests to the north come there. Hunting tribes from the Great Plains to the south and west come there. They bring the products of the hunt, meat, skins, etc., and exchange them for the agricultural products of the Mandan villages. Right? That's a natural exchange. And they've been doing that for a long time. Now, horses are coming into those villages from the south. Guns are coming into those villages from the north. So those trade networks that had gravitated to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara villages before now are humming with activity because people are going there to trade for the things that they need. So Cheyenne people, for instance, travel to the Arikara villages. They bring the products of the buffalo hunt, meat, buffalo skins, but also they bring horses. And they get at those villages agricultural produce, but also now guns, steel weapons. Right? The Cheyenne then head back south to the plains, where they perhaps trade some of those guns and horses to the guns and weapons to the Arapahoes, who in turn will sell them horses that they may have gotten from the Kiowas or the Comanches. Right? And then the Cheyennes repeat the process. And the Arapahoes repeat that process with neighbors to the south. Right? So these people are not living in isolation. They are all intercommunicating and connecting with one another, which sets them up for disaster. In 1779, smallpox breaks out in Mexico City. Liz Fenn talks about how this smallpox had been prevalent in the eastern part of America earlier. At the siege of Boston, Washington has his army inoculated against it. We're not sure if the epidemic that breaks out in Mexico in 1779 is the same one that had made its way there or if it's another one. But between September 1779 and December 1779, there are 18,000 deaths in North America, in Mexico City. From there, it spreads to everywhere, basically. It goes south, Colombia, Ecuador, goes to Yucatan, spreads to Baja California, spreads to Santa Fe and San Antonio by 1780. And one of the reasons we know so much about this smallpox epidemic is because there are now people, Europeans, in place to record its impact. So Spanish priests in Pueblo mission villages record the death toll. Something like 8,000 people die in New Mexico. But when it hits San Antonio and hits Santa Fe, it is hitting places where Indian people have been coming for years to get horses, and they are still coming to get horses. So when Lewis and Clark meet the Shoshones in their trek across the West in 1804, 1805, they see that the Shoshones have horses with Spanish brands, Spanish saddles, Spanish bridles. And they say, where'd you get those horses? And the Shoshones say, we get them from the Spaniards to the south. They are a dozen days' ride away. We know that the symptoms of smallpox take 12 to 14 days to reveal themselves, at which point you begin to get the high fever and the lesions on the skin and all of those horrible attributes of it. That means that Shoshone guys who went south to steal or trade for horses were back home, and picked up smallpox, were back home kissing their children, hugging their wives, before they knew they had smallpox. And it breaks out among the Shoshones in 1780. From the Shoshones, it spreads to the Blackfeet, and we know why exactly. Because a Blackfoot oral tradition given to a British fur trader tells how this happened. The Blackfeet and the Shoshones were at conflict. A Blackfoot war party thought they had found a Shoshone village and called it napping. They attacked, tore open the teepees with their knives, and then recoiled in horror because the lodges were full of dead and dying people and rotting corpses. And the Blackfoot turned and fled for home and took the smallpox with them. And from the Blackfoot, it spread north to the Chippewyans, where it's estimated 80% of the people died. And it spread to the Crees and to the Ojibwas, who had been operating as middlemen between the Blackfeet and British traders on the shores of Hudson Bay, the Hudson Bay Company. In the winter of 1783, 1784, Hudson Bay traders note in their journals that it's very quiet, that the Ojibwa and Cree people who would normally at that season of the year come to the bay to trade their beaver pelts at the Hudson Bay Company posts were not there. So the traders head west into Indian country to those communities, to those villages, to see what's up. And they find the villages essentially gone. They go into the lodges of the Indians and collect the beaver pelts from among the bodies of the people who've died of this epidemic. This is the same epidemic that broke out in Mexico City 3-4 years before. And it spread all the way across the western half of North America, transmitted from group to group, community to community, by indigenous people who were in almost constant communication, operating along well-traveled trade networks, in part well-traveled and well-trodden by horses. So this epidemic would not have had the prevalence and virulence that it had without the prior introduction of horses by the Spaniards and the adoption of horses into native society. The adoption of horses into Plains Indian society brought them unprecedented mobility, prosperity, and power. But those horses were also Trojan horses in a way, because when smallpox came, it followed those routes. Now, if we look back to the Mandan and Hidatsa people, let's look west before we look to Mandan and Hidatsa people. This smallpox epidemic also hits the Columbia River and the Northwest Coast. And this is what George Vancouver, British sea captain, saw evidence of when in Liz Fenn's article he talks about seeing skeletons on the beach in that area. Massive smallpox epidemic in that area in the late 1780s. We know that it came from this epidemic, that Shoshones and other people who were in contact with Columbia River peoples will have spread it to the river, and from there it went to the Northwest Coast. But it may also have come from another direction. If you look at this map of the world, it shows on it the workings of the sea otter trade. Peoples on the coast of, say, Washington, Oregon, had been relatively isolated from European contact prior to the late 18th century. But in the late 18th century, Europeans discovered sea otters. And sea otters are have incredibly lustrous pelts, far more so than beavers. And there's a huge demand for these rich, warm pelts in China. Other places too, but primarily in China. And Europeans and then Americans figured out that if you could take sea otters from the northwest coast of America to China and trade them, and then fill up your cargoes in China and trade back to London or to Boston, you could make a huge killing. Now, the Russians had been sort of pioneering, if you like, this sea otter trade to some degree on the coast of Alaska. But it's really with Captain James Cook, the British sea captain who sailed the globe, that it comes to the forefront. And one of the people who sailed on James Cook's expedition was a Dartmouth dropout by the name of John Ledyard. We named a bridge after him. He had spent a year at Dartmouth, dropped out, and happened to be in England about the time the American Revolution broke out, which was also the time when James Cook was recruiting for his voyage around the world. Ledyard signed up. So he was on this voyage. Cook sails from England all the way around the southern tip of South America, up to the northwest coast. And there, his ships lay anchor, and they trade to the Indians the products of the Industrial Revolution in England, right? Copper, chisels, metal chisels, woolen blankets, guns, alcohol, all of this stuff that Indian people want. And in return, he gets sea otter pelts, crams his ships with sea otter pelts. They then sail off, spend the winter in Hawaii, where Cook gets himself killed by Hawaiian native people. The crew carry on to China. And then they unload the cargo of sea otter pelts and exchange them for silk, spices, tea, the things that will bring a huge price in England, and carry on back to England. Right? So at every point where that voyage touched land, right, trading manufactured goods for sea otter pelts for spices and silk, selling it for British pounds, they make a killing. Obviously, it catches on. Other European nations get involved. John Ledyard lobbies Congress and says, we've got to get involved. The United States got to get involved. And when the United States does get involved, it has an advantage, particularly Boston, because American ships do not have to cross the Atlantic before they start the voyage. So this becomes, by 1800, very much an American trade. Right? But what it means is that the Indian people living on the northwest coast are connected by trade routes that link them to the rest of the world. Right? And it's possible and maybe even likely that the Indian nations on the coasts of Washington and Oregon that contract smallpox in the 1780s get it not only coming from the interior of America, but get it from Russia, because there's a massive smallpox epidemic in Eastern Russia at the same time. Indian people becoming part of this global commercial network, which means, of course, that they become vulnerable to global pandemics, as happens with cholera in 1849, which is killing Indian people on the Oregon Trail and had broken out in India the year before. Now, smallpox doesn't just end after this pandemic. It's a recurrent visitor. This is a winter count, which is a Lakota calendar of events in which each symbol represents a memorable event for a particular year, so that the tribal historian, if you like, can look at this and say, that was the year when this happened, and that was also the year when these other things happened, right? So you read these from the center outwards, right, like following a spiral outwards. And if you look at this in the middle, the second symbol, just about in the middle, if you can see it, is a head and torso spotted red, which means it's a symbol, it's a universal symbol on winter counts, that this is a smallpox or measles epidemic. It's actually smallpox, because this was a smallpox epidemic that hit the Missouri River in 1801, 1802. And Lewis and Clark, when they went up the Missouri from St. Louis in 1804, still talked about passing deserted villages. Neat thing about winter counts is that they are kept by different communities covering different times, but just about every winter count that I've seen has one event on it which everybody records. If you look from that center symbol of the smallpox victim and then look to your, look kind of down to the left, if you like, if the smallpox figure is 12 o'clock, look to 7 o'clock. Right? And the middle symbol there, you'll see a crescent surrounded by stars. Right? That is a meteor shower. It happened in November 1833. Everybody in what is now the Western United States saw it. Every winter count recorded it. So you pick up a winter count, you find that symbol, and then you can date all the other symbols on the calendar. Right? So for tracking a smallpox epidemic, you can read one winter count against another to see where a same smallpox epidemic occurred at different times. Right? And you see them recurrently happening across the plains. Another devastating epidemic happens in 1837, and it kills this guy. This is Matotope, or Forebears, who was the second principal chief of the Mandans. Had his portrait painted several times by George Catlin and Carl Bodmer, visiting his village in the early 1830s. A renowned warrior, a great leader, which meant he was a man of humanity and generosity. And in 1837, he dies of smallpox with, he says, his face rotting in such a way that even the wolves recoiled in horror from him. What happened? In 1831, there's a smallpox epidemic on the Central Plains. You can see here it hits the Pawnees. Pawnees got hammered by smallpox in 1780, again in 1825, and again in 1831. When that smallpox epidemic runs its course, the American Fur Company lobbies Congress to start vaccinating Indian people. By now, Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine is an effective prevention of smallpox. Congress votes the money, and a vaccination program is initiated and implemented on the Missouri River. It gets about as far as pure South Dakota and runs out of money. Several years later, an American steamship on the Missouri River docks at Fort Clark, which is next to the Mandan villages. Right? So let's look at the Mandan population. When the French first encounter the Mandans, they estimate their population is maybe 15,000 people. By the end of 1780, that is after the massive smallpox epidemic we've just been talking about, and after increasing attacks by the Sioux, Mandan population has dropped to about 3,500. The Mandans tell Lewis and Clark that they used to have many more villages than they do now. Now they're in a couple of villages. In June of 1837, Mandan population is between 1,600 and 2,000 people. This steamship docks. It has smallpox on board. Smallpox breaks out among the Mandan. By October, Mandan population has been sized to 138 people. The Mandans and their Hidatsa and Arikara nation neighbors kind of huddle together, move north further up the river, and create a new community and become the three affiliated tribes, which they are to this day, the residents of the Fort Berthold Reservation. But what now happens in 1837 is a repeat in reverse of what had happened in 1779, 1780. The Mandan villages are a trade center, right? And so the smallpox that breaks out there spreads rapidly north, south, and west. Right? Goes to the Assiniboine, goes to the Blackfeet, travels south across the Great Plains, and it appears on Kiowa calendars in 1840, 1839, 40. That's the smallpox epidemic that had been killing Mandans. Now it's killing Kiowas. These kinds of things happen recurrently, so that native populations are being cut and cut and cut. Native leaders who are trying to negotiate with the federal government or resist American expansion are losing far more people, often their own family members, at home than they are in resisting American expansion. This is a massive part of the story of Native America. It's one that, I was going to say historians, but I think we as people don't like to pay too much attention to, because it shows human beings not in control of their own destinies, human beings vulnerable to lethal, destructive epidemics over which they have no control. And very often in history, we'd look back to the Black Death or the Great Plague in London and all those kinds of things. And we're so distant from that in time that we can almost attribute that to different kind of people. They didn't know anything back then. They didn't have our knowledge. They didn't have our medical sophistication. Well, we've come to an abrupt reminder of just how vulnerable we as humans are, no matter our power, prosperity, and sophistication. So America's been through this before. Indigenous peoples have been through this before. Like a lot of Native American history, this is a chilling tale. It's one that's very brutal and bloody, and very depressing. But the other side of the Native American history that we look at through this period is of survival, of human resilience and capacity to weather the almost unthinkable assaults on our societies and on our communities and on our systems of value. So take care, look after yourselves, look after your families, and I hope to see many of you in class, in a real class, when things are looking brighter. Thank you.